Milon's Secret Castle on NES is a pretty divisive game depending on who you ask about it, but for me it was a fantastic experience. I fell in love with it the same way that I did with The Legend of Zelda or Legacy of the Wizard, embracing its challenge of checking every inch of every place I visited for hints and secrets. It was only recently that I learned about its official sequel in Do-Re-Mi Fantasy, Milon's Doki Doki Adventure on the Super Famicom. It continues Milon's story after he presumably succeeded in learning the musical language of his people following the events of the first game. The tale begins with some gorgeous cutscenes showing Milon heading out into the forest on a sunny afternoon with his pals. Out of nowhere, a horrible demon named Amon appears and makes off with Alice the fairy, leaving Milon and Colin to rush back home to launch a rescue plan. While it isn't obvious what Amon specifically needs from Alice, it is made clear that failing to save her would be catastrophic for their world. In order to save the day, 5 instruments have to not only be recovered, but also uncursed in order to be able to wield their power. The version of the game that I played was patched with an English translation, since the original release on the Super Famicom has Japanese text. It should go without saying that knowing what's going on story-wise adds quite a bit to the experience, but I think it would have been very possible to play without that context. The little interjections of plot exposition did a very good job conveying the story elements, as well as each of the techniques that Milon learns throughout the game. These were actually really well written and funny, and though the story's meanderings were silly rather than serious most of the time, I still found them to be quite charming. I can only think of one instance where the translation lied to me about which buttons to use for a new move, but thankfully I wasn't held up for too long before I had it all sorted out. The only things that I think would have been impossible without English instructions are the mini-games. There's a few different ones to play, but truth be told, even with the directives right in front of me, I still managed to mess up what I was supposed to be doing sometimes. At least none of them were mandatory to win the game, or else I might have been in pretty deep trouble. Even if the translation wasn't always the smoothest, it was welcome considering that there's no translated manual available. I looked everywhere for one to no avail, but there is a crispy scan of the Japanese booklet to flip through if you're interested. It has some lovely character art and even seems to detail the different places the game takes you through, but unfortunately, very little of its contents meant much to me until after I'd completed the adventure. Anyway, the game split up into different worlds that each have their own theme. You'll be visiting the usual forests, caves, and ice areas, along with a couple of others to liven things up a little. Even if the environments aren't anything mind-blowingly fresh on their own, they do stand out in their design, expressly in how they look. If you hadn't already noticed, the graphics are simply stunning. I love how colorful and layered everything is, from the backgrounds to the enemies, and even Milon himself. Although you only ever move two-dimensionally here, each of the stages has a surprising sense of depth that makes each area feel both immersive and enchanting. In particular, the monster animations were some of my favorite details. They all have a few different movements and facial expressions depending on whether they're just doing monster stuff or getting hopped on by our determined hero. And all of that doesn't even cover their terrified little faces while they're locked away inside of Milon's bubbles waiting for doom. Seeing them so sad made me feel a bit bad for putting them in there, but I really didn't have another choice in the matter. A close second in delightfulness was Milon's own animation range. Whether he's jumping, falling a long distance, or getting wrecked, his sprite's always portraying it beautifully. The artwork here can be described as nothing short of endearing, and I thought it really added a lot to the refined nature of this quest. Another thing that stood out to me was just how perfect character movement feels in Do-Re-Mi Fantasy. In many Super Nintendo platformers that I've played, the main character's sprite is usually the size of a house compared to what's around them. A lot of the time, I usually struggle trying to guide them through tight spaces. Not to mention the fact that they're a huge target for enemy attacks because they simply take up so much of the screen. While this is obviously not true of every SNES game, in quite a few circumstances, giant character size has been enough of a hindrance that it's negatively impacted my enjoyment of certain titles. Here though, Milon's sprite is nice and small, making the controls feel spacious and fluid comparatively. Even though he's got a ton of animation as he moves, you don't feel that while you're playing. There's never any delay when changing directions, jumping, or returning back to normal after a special move is complete, which I can't say about many games from this generation. The people who worked on this one were able to achieve something really solid here, and I don't feel like any other part of the experience had to suffer because of it. Something I really wasn't expecting at all was how distinctive individual stages felt from each other. While this is a platformer at heart, what you have to do in each level to get to the goal was always evolving. Alongside some lighter single-path areas, there were tricky auto-scrollers as well as vast mazes that required poring over many branches to find a key to exit. No matter what was thrown at me, all of it seemed thoughtfully crafted and was extremely enjoyable to figure out. And that variety is not the only thing that kept the gameplay from getting stale. As you recover each of the instruments, you get to learn new abilities from the locals, like making a ladder out of musical notes to get to higher ledges, for example. This kind of stuff gets you thinking about the surroundings differently and even encourages some creative thinking when choosing where to go next or how to get there. I really adore when games can innovate beyond the tried and true platforming formula and really bring a unique flavor and style to the experience. Do-Re-Mi Fantasy is a perfect example of this. What I found worked incredibly well was that all of these new features are added in one at a time and gradually build up along with more difficult platforming and puzzly aspects into late game. I thought the difficulty increased at a near perfect pace, with plenty of opportunity to practice each skill before they were needed under dire circumstances. Compared to other games I've played, this one felt to be on the easier side, at least when we're talking about the regular levels. The boss encounters are another story entirely that I'll get to shortly here, but if there's one thing that Do-Re-Mi Fantasy does extremely well, it's setting the player up for success. You have the benefit of unlimited continues and plenty of chances to grab extra lives and health refills in almost every stage. I certainly won't sit here and pretend that I breezed through the whole game in a single sitting because there were quite a few stages that caused me grief, especially in the fire and ice worlds. Like most things in gaming though, a little practice went a long way. As a bit of an aside here, I will say that while I did enjoy this game's style, I really missed the mysteriousness of Milon Secret Castle's gameplay. It was sorely absent from this sequel, with the biggest glaring omission being the lack of rewarding exploration. Please don't get me wrong, you can still blast out blocks to find power-ups and other hidden stuff, but the all-important stars needed to uncurse the instruments are usually just sitting out in the open in plain sight on the way to the goal. They didn't even try to hide most of them, nor are many of them even difficult to get to at all. I feel like this really trivialized what was supposed to be the driving force of the entire plot. It's like all the effort went into the amazing graphics and stage planning, but the challenge of actually fulfilling the quest was more of an afterthought. While I do think Do-Re-Mi Fantasy is a fantastic platformer for all the reasons I've already mentioned, I couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed that it didn't have more depth, especially after how well I got on with its prequel. Just to be clear, that's not a knock on Do-Re-Mi Fantasy. I just thought that this unmet expectation was worth mentioning since these two games are linked in much more than name only. I suppose I shouldn't really have gotten my hopes up too high because it's not like this was the first time a sequel wasn't quite the same as the original. Now onto the bosses. They're definitely the exception in what otherwise feels like a very even experience. In terms of their level of toil, they come in at both ends of the spectrum. Some are total wimps, while others kept me crawling back for my next whipping. The 3-hit life bar you're given here never seems like it's enough. This is especially true in some of the longer stages, but that feeling was always amplified in these boss fights. As nimbly as Milon moves, he's no match for the speed and size of these jerks and all the things they throw around. I really had to work at these encounters to win, with the final battle being an exceptionally difficult time sink. On the bright side though, there's a compassionate design choice that makes losing in a boss fight sting less. After perishing for the first time in one of these confrontations, when you re-enter the stage, you get to go right back to the fight again without needing to replay the whole level. This is permanent and even applies over however many continues it takes to get the job done, and I loved this feature. There's honestly nothing more frustrating than getting into the groove with a fight pattern, dying, and then having to do a bunch of other stuff before getting a chance to try again. It was nice being able to get straight back into the action. Another really refreshing detail is that you could go back to previously completed stages at any time. If you wanted to farm lives or grab a couple of power-ups before re-attempting a tough area or a nasty boss fight, you could. All of the power-ups are really helpful, like the Featherfall boots that slow your descent, as well as the bubblegum that gives you a second chance at life if you fall into a pit. That second one's definitely my favorite, given how prone I am to stumbling into every pit I see. Unfortunately, I found the music to be hit or miss. Now, the fact that Do-Re-Mi Fantasy has more than one waltz on repeat puts it head and shoulders above Milon Secret Castle, but there were a couple of songs that weren't so great. The soundtrack is almost as diverse as the gameplay style, ranging from playful and light to abstractly experimental and even ambient in some tracks. For every song I was bopping my head along to, there was another that made me lean in a little closer to figure out what I was actually listening to. The dips in the music quality only made me appreciate the next time I got to hear the good tunes again. But even if it was a little weird on occasion, it's far from the worst soundtrack I've ever heard. Interesting would be a good way to describe that experience. Doremi Fantasy is unquestionably a shining jewel in the Super Famicom library. It's got competent level design and fresh mechanics that really drive the fun factor to new heights the whole way along. While I personally would have loved if this game had followed in Milon Secret Castle's footsteps more closely, this experience nonetheless turned out to be a lovely alternative. It invited a completely different audience to enjoy this character's story and step into his shoes for a little while. It's honestly a pity that a game this good was never localized for English-speaking audiences officially, but even without a language patch, it's a winner in my book, and I can't recommend it enough.